Hello, World Civilization 107 class. I would like to just make some extra clarifications about some of the topics we're covering because I think that they're so important and because they keep carrying over into our modern political discourse. So first of all, what we're seeing is that World War I and World War II were actually world wars. And what I'm hoping, especially this week as we go over Indian soldiers fighting on behalf of the Allies, that this one story alone just kind of blows out of the water this very limited Eurocentric and American-centric view of these wars. And I could have incorporated also more on African participation and Burmese. I can go on and on. This is just a taste of what to make of this aspect of our world civilization classes. Now, why I'm trying to cover more about the accurate history of communism and socialism and having a little bit more of a discussion about fascism is because these European ideologies are going to be very important ideologies, significant and relevant and influence on the non-Western world as well. And we're going to learn more about that later on, like as we deal with going over China and Korea and Vietnam and all of those nations that embraced Marxism, Leninism, and pretty much incorporated much of the Stalinist state structure of the Soviet Union. But there was also a wild set of variables in there. And so... And then I just kind of want to just clarify some things about misinformation that happens in American political scene. Now, right now, I'm currently writing a book on the misrepresentation of the topic of socialism within American discourse in particular. Now, I want to just state at this moment that I'm not making a debate of whether or not socialism is good at this moment. I'm talking about misrepresentation of the topic and the distortion of the topic, which makes it ahistorical or just very distorted. So sometimes we forget that, when we're having a discussion about one thing, we're immediately trying to think that we're going into another direction with it. Right now, for a moment, let's just presume that socialism isn't something that we want to advocate on behalf of. I'm arguing that still in American politics, there is an extreme distortion of the topic. And so, and the same with fascism. So, as I showed in one of the other videos, so let me just kind of point out something, and then we're going to backtrack to this time. And I'm going to try to make this very brief, but very important. I know somebody who literally voted for Bernie Sanders and then voted for Trump and became a Trump supporter. Now, for a lot of people, this seems very strange because it seems like that a Bernie Sanders supporter and a Trump supporter are the exact opposite of each other. They are actually, but here's where there's overlap. A Bernie Sanders supporter, especially Bernie Sanders when he was running to be potentially the president, and a Trump supporter are people who loathe mainstream politics. They are so disgusted with the government. They don't like the politics of people like Biden or even McConnell, what are considered to be mainstream Republicans, mainstream Democrats. And so they like going into outsiders, people who are critiquing, hard critique of what they perceive to be problems within the state. So early on, as we're learning from World War I, well, from the 19th century, but really kind of being manifest and from World War I on, is the communists and the various socialists, they agreed that there was a problem with capitalism, and that capitalism was the problem, and that democracy was in a crisis. That liberalism, and the term liberal actually, in its classical sense, just meant free market economy. That's what we're talking about. That's what they're referring to with liberalism, okay? Non-socialist. So this is very, very, very much not socialist economy when you talk about liberal economy. In American politics now, a liberal is someone who's viewed that believes in big government. This is the opposite way of the classical sense of the term, okay? Just to make clear. So they saw that problem. The far right politically in Europe, they thought that capitalism was also a problem being left unchecked because they valued things like identity politics. Identity politics originates with the far right in that they're into national identity, nationalism, your ethnic group being properly represented, or your nation state. That was the true value. And they saw that capitalism is pretty much amoral. It's not that it's immoral. And that they wanted to have a political party that could protect the national identity and character of the nation. Ultimately, that's the difference. So where it gets confusing is that Hitler called themselves the National Socialists. Keep in mind that was really more or less a marketing ploy. Socialism was popular at the time. Hitler was not focused on the economy as the main issue in the sense of there being a different way to do the economy. Sorry about this, earplug keeps falling out. He was focused on the nationalism and racism is what he was focused on. He was more obsessed with the problem of what he perceived to be of Jews and minorities and weak elements and all this other kind of stuff. Fascism comes out of Italy, and that influence is also based on nationalism. Mussolini was a socialist at first, and then he moved away into more or less to the field of far-right politics. And so there's a myth, there's this distortion that people in Europe find very laughable when I was there, that the American conservatives keep saying that that Hitler, Nazis, and Mussolini are all socialists and originate with the left. That's a distortion of history. I'm just saying, okay, you can still not agree to communism or socialism and leftist politics, but I'm going to tell you right now, you are just in fantasy land if you're saying that these men, Hitler and Mussolini, are associated with the left. They saw themselves the enemies of the left. Now, the fact that some of them came out of leftist circles doesn't change anything. A person can be a Christian and become an atheist. You can be an atheist and become a Christian. But like I told you, the reason why some of these characters some would go from the left to the right, and the right, or others from the right to the left, because they were all critical of mainstream politics. That's what they had in common, really, the most. And then they became the mortal enemies of each other because those were the two most popular outside-the-box ideologies. Basically, the socialist of all variants camp versus the far-right fascist ultranationalist camp. Okay? And those battles carried on into the rest of the globe. Now, I want to point something out again really quick as well. You have people like Jordan Peterson and some other critics of communism act as if communism ruins everything that it touches, meaning that things were going well before. So let's just do a quick check on this and keep this in mind when you move forward in this class. When was Russia ever a free democratic society and had a strong human rights record and upward mobility capitalism? When in its history? When communists came, they were under the Tsar, right? They were under authoritarian regimes from Peter the Great, Catherine the Great. This is all really not a democratic society, very authoritarian, so on. Then later we're going to learn about China. And you're going to ask this question again. Was China ever free, democratic, strong human rights, upward mobility? And then more importantly, as we are eventually going to look into other so-called third world nations that are going to embrace communism and socialist economies, you're going to see that they were actually under the colonial control of the British, the French, and or dominated by the United States or other Western powers. In other words, they weren't free societies. They were being oppressed by the Western non-communist world. So when they wanted to resist against that world, what was their options? Who would they go to find resistance to that? It'd be the Soviet Union and later on China. And so my whole point is that I'm trying to make is that there's been an oversimplification about the context of when in which communist regimes came about and socialist economies. Now, it's a different set of arguments to try to explore of whether or not those systems were successful. For the most part, we can say that many of them were absolutely failures and sometimes worse. Cambodia, we'll cover, was a massive tragedy as well in terms of human rights and everything. But again, it's a distorted view of things. And also, if we look in Europe, it's the far right that we see the rise of authoritarian regimes. In Western Europe, outside of Eastern Europe, for the most part, communists and socialists work within democratic institutions. Again, in the Western part of Europe, it was always the far right that was actually overthrowing democracy. And so here, again, so what's the point that I'm making? In the United States, if you talk about universal health care or you talk about some of ideas that seem to be socialistic, you're always going to hear yourself being compared to Hitler or Mussolini by some, or they're going to talk about the Soviet Union or Venezuela or some other places. And my point is that the socialist sphere in Western world has often been very much in compliance with democracy, has respected that, and universal health care and all these other things have come about within those spheres, and that the communist states where authoritarianism has been there and a full socialist economy has been implemented, it's often been by countries that were actually being exploited and manipulated by the Western world, and they were attempting to fix their problem of being under colonial control and having a disproportionate amount of the resources going to outside the country or to a few elites within the country. And so the socialist economy was an attempt to fix something that was already wrong and broken. So what happens is just because socialism didn't work in those countries or there was a problem and human rights abuses, what I'm arguing is that was a failed attempt to fix something that was already broken. So this is what's missing in the discussion about these topics that you hear in the United States. Think about these arguments I'm making as we continue on in the next few weeks. And then later on, if you want to know my opinion about the total legacy of socialism and its positive and negative aspects, that's another topic we can cover later. But I want you to just get you thinking about how to rethink the approach of these topics that we're going to be covering in the next few weeks. And feel free to challenge me on any of this as well. I appreciate those of you who are interested in this topic, and I look forward to using historical examples to make a case for the points that I'm trying to show for all of you. So I hope you're all having a good week. I got to get new microphone and ear things at some point. All right. We'll be in touch, everyone. Take care.